Hey, this is Judah Mantel from SceneForge Studio, and this video is going to go over version 0.5.30. It has a couple of new improvements to the way the timeline system works, as I'll show, as well as a lot of new improvements to the way the light scattering and volumetric lighting works in the scene that I'm really excited about. So let's jump right in. Okay, we have this scene here. It's a kind of a basic little room that I set up with the color light checker and some ambient occlusion in the corners and stuff like that. So before I go on to the volumetric lighting, let's talk about the timeline. You can see I can scrub through. I have this really basic motion of the color light checker. Now, a couple things have changed. One, when you record handheld motion, and using the mobile app, previously when you played it back, it was very almost jittery. That's because each keyframe used a linear curve by default, which resulted in that very choppy motion. Now, behind the scenes, by default, it defaults to an in-out sine wave, which just results in much smoother motion, much more natural handheld motion. Now, let's say you're editing a scene, they have a ton of keyframes, which we don't have right now, but pretend there's a ton of keyframes here, and we don't want the object to update as we scrub through, or we just want to disable some of the motion of animations while we're editing the scene. That's why this little eye icon, or this little eye toggle, has been added. This allows you to essentially mute, quote-unquote, different tracks, so that when you play it back, any tracks that have the eyeball icon toggled gets ignored or disabled. So it just makes it a little bit easier for controlling what happens when you animate and work with your scene. Now also, up until now, there was no way to reorder these tracks. Now if you right-click on the thing, you can just click Move Layer Down, and you can reorder things that way. So it's much more convenient. It adds a lot more customization to the way you work with the timeline. So that is the new timeline settings. Now let's talk about the visuals in the scene. So if you don't know, volumetric lighting or volumetric scattering is essentially simulating the way light interacts with nearly invisible particles in the air. So on a foggy day, you can see light beams coming down from street lights, or you can see the light beam shining through trees. That's volumetric lighting, and it exists in the real world because of the way the world works. There are little water droplets or different particles in the air. Dust is a big factor, and in 3D environments, that's not really something that is in play by default. Now, up until now, we only had the sun shaft VFX toggle, and that essentially did that, but only when you're looking directly at the sun, which obviously is not a very common scenario. But now this toggle works much more globally. So when I enable this, you'll see we get a slight boost in the intensity of the lighting of the scene. That's because now, as I change the time of day, you can see the light scattering in the atmosphere. So it's a very subtle effect, but it adds to the realness or the physicality of the scene. So you can see as the light moves through our little room here, we can see the light beam shining through. As I move around, you can see it. Now keep in mind, this is an extra process happening in the background, so it does, you can see the lighting over here, it does require heavier graphics card power. For most cases it should be fine, but just keep that in mind. So that is global volumetric lighting. Now let's talk about volumetric lighting on a per rig basis. So I'm going to close this. We'll leave that all enabled. It's worth noting that all of this does interact properly with the fog. So if I make it much foggier, you can see this effect is a lot more visible as I move the camera around, or the light around. So now let's bring in a spotlight. Now previously, the spotlights and other types of rig lights, the volumetric lighting was very almost inaccurate to what you were setting over here, and that wasn't really ideal. Now it works the same way. You have your toggle, and you turn it on, you can see it much better, and it properly reacts to the settings you're setting over here. So it looks a lot better and works much better. Now if I bring in a light bulb, you'll see that the volumetric VFX toggle is actually gone. That's because point lights, or lights that emit from all directions, a light bulb, interacts volumetrically with the global lighting in the scene. So it's only toggleable based on what you set in the visual settings. So it's not as customizable, but the results are much more consistent and realistic. And for box lights and panel lights, it works the same way. We have our light here, and we can turn on the volumetric VFX. Looks really great, and it adjusts properly. So those are the new improvements in version 0.5.30. And this is kind of part of my journey of just adding more and more photorealism to the way your scenes work in SceneForge. The one thing that is still lacking is global illumination for the sunlight. So for example, spotlights, if I make it dark here, you can set up the indirect lighting using this drop down. So it's multiplied, or using ray trace lighting based on the scene. But based on the sunlight, there is no global illumination, and that's something that I'm working very hard on, which will just add more and more realism to your scenes as you create them. And so with that, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.